Good morning. So, let's walk into the darkness together. Well, but don't worry, I'll protect you. Well, but the question is who's going to protect me, because this is a fairly rough neighborhood that I live in. The glamours of being, well, a resident of the outskirts of Gothenburg. No worries, I've survived this far. I'll do it again. So, I thought I was going to talk to you about perfect code, or the ambition that some people have, me included. I used to be this guy. The ambition and probably you will too, depending on what type of developer you want to become, or the type of person that you want to be in when it comes to your job or programming or whatever. And there is this desire you will find that you have. This desire where you've just gotten to a point where you feel like you understand coding, and you start reading all these gurus, different blog posts like Martin Fowler, Bob Martin, or Robert Martin, and you start reading books such as Clean Code and I don't know, best practices books and all that stuff, and all of a sudden you realize that there are all these subtle rules. Well, it's not subtle, but these rules that people have established, best practices, yada 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 yada. And you will start to have this desire to try and make your code pretty. It's gonna happen, trust me. You are going to start to kind of try to, well, impress is a strong word, but you're going to try and make your code as nice and well made and like fancy as, if you will, as you can. Some people even go far and like to try to shoehorn in solutions more because it's mentally stimulating for them to do so, than that they convince themselves that this is the way to do it because this is useful, instead of using what would have been an adequate solution. You will probably, if you've ever watched one of my videos where I talk about monads, I have my favorite example where I actually, for a job application here in Gothenburg, had to go through some code where somebody had thrown in a monad on 2 function calls in the code base. And you will probably recall that I am very, very verbal in my dislike for such, like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. That person is adding this not because it makes sense for the code. They're adding it simply because, hey, I want to show that I can build a monad in JavaScript. And the thing I want to talk to you about, and this is just from my own experience. When I first started, and I started developing and for real, like my first job, I was just coming out of school. I had just started to get into this phase. Like, I got in there very, very early. Even in the first months of my education, I started, hardcore unit testing, trying to use the patterns that I was taught, the best practices, all of that stuff. And my teacher, I remember my final exam, one of them, and my teacher had, God bless him, or I don't know, Newton bless him, he had put a comment on my results, and he had said that I understood that you were trying to use best practices, but your code is almost it was difficult for me to understand, and I think that you've made the code worse. Now, this was a hard pill for me to swallow, I will admit. This was not fun at all, because you have to understand that when I first started programming, it was life-changing for me. I felt like I had found the thing that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. The job, rather. It was like it was literally, it was almost a religious experience, and I became zealous to the point, and in many ways I still am, but I became zealous to the point where I think I actually, like, it was like I repelled a lot of my some of my classmates, because it wasn't, I would never, I would not talk about anything besides programming. And as I said, sometimes I still have that. But what I talked to him, and like over the years I realized that I had the same issue at my first job. A lot of the stuff that we made, like I was trying to make the code perfect. I was trying to make sure that we had 100% unit test coverage, and you know, I didn't have much in terms of experience, so I missed that. You know, my boss was really unhappy because, like, my bosses were really unhappy because everything took really long for me to deliver. And even though I tried to make everything perfect and like use these best practices and use all these fancy patterns, I still had bugs, I still had issues, and as I was making everything more complicated than they needed to be, it was difficult to move forward. In other words, even though I was trying to adhere to all these great practices, I made the code worse. And I realized that, and it's not that long ago, I realized that if I simply try to go for simplicity and maintainability, and then the third thing is really only speed, like trying to just make it as quickly as possible. And rather than trying to do the best practices thing to start off with, and actually just discover that, hey, I've done this thing 3 or 4 times, or like this code isn't all that pretty, maybe I should fix it and like refactor it. I'm actually able to produce things much faster, and they still work, and they're not that difficult to change. And this was kind of eye-opening for me, to instead of trying to write perfect code on the first try, write it, like, swallow your pride. Like, if somebody criticizes your code, because trust me, you're going to be afraid of that. If you show people your code, you're probably going to feel a little bit nervous, and that's okay. Instead, you know, be open, like be humble, and say that, yeah, like when I was writing this for the very first time, I was prioritizing doing these things. And if you've done your job well, in my opinion, the person who is going to give you some criticism, they're going to say, oh, you should do this and that, and why didn't you do that? It's the code mocking, if you will. Everybody does it. You know, somebody else wrote this bullshit, I didn't, and therefore it's not good. And then you simply say, okay, cool, can you change it? And they will be able, if you did your job well, they should be able to change that code very easily. And that's what you should go for. Because you will never write perfect code. It's that simple. Because what's good code and bad code is very subjective. And it's also depending on who is like actually looking at your code, like their opinion of it is also going to factor in. So instead of trying to write things perfectly on the first go, try to make them simple and maintainable, and then simply go for release speed.